beneath the bruised and sullen Iowa sky, where the wind keens like a widow's lament through the skeletal corn, did Harold Grayson, 75 winters, etched deep into his weathered hide. A widower tethered to a farm crumbling into dust. Ever fathom that a woman's gaze could stab through his soul like a rusted blade, awakening a hunger he'd sworn to bury with his long-dead wife last Sunday as he stood at the Shell station in Baxter, Iowa, wrestling diesel into his battered Ford, a relic of better days. His gnarled cane leaned against the fender like a silent mourner. She descended upon him, a raven-haired siren, mid-40s, her red scarf a violent slash against the ashen gray of the world, her lips parted as though exhaling secrets too wicked to speak aloud. 3 seconds. She pinned him across that desolate lot, 3 eternal seconds that clawed at his chest, igniting a forbidden ember where only cold ash should reign. She slipped into her blue sedan, a chariot of temptation, and tore down Route 6, leaving Harold frozen, diesel pooling at his boots like spilled blood. A pulse he hadn't felt since Mary's frail frame went still in 03, hammering through his brittle, aging veins with a ferocity that mocked his years. Harold's farm is a sepulchre of lost time, 50 acres of corn gone feral, twisting into grotesque shapes under the relentless wind. A barn slumping eastward as if bowing to its own decay. A gray clapboard house sagging under the weight of neglect, its windows gaping like the hollow eyes of a skull. At 75, his hair is a scant veil of white, thinning to frail wisps that dance in the breeze. His hands twisted into claws by decades of clawing at unforgiving earth. His spine bent as though crushed by the sins of his youth. Mary was his sanctuary, first glimpsed in 51 at a church picnic. Her yellow dress, a burst of sunlight against the drab green of the field. Him 26, brash and cocksure. A pack of Chesterfields bulging in his pocket. A grin splitting his face as he won her with a bold wink. 50 years they forged together. A union of sweat and quiet vows, until cancer devoured her in 03, leaving him with a porch swing that creaks a mournful tune and a silence that presses against his ribs like a shroud. Dawn fractures the dark at 5, and he rises, bones groaning, joints popping to scatter grain for 6 emaciated hens whose clucks mock his solitude. He tends a pitiful patch of carrots and beans, their meager yield a bitter penance for surviving her. Sundays, he drags the Ford into town, gas at the Shell, a dented can of Spam, and a loaf of stale bread from Miller's store. A grunt to the clerk, who sees only a shadow where a man once stood. It's his frail tether to existence, a ritual to stave off the inevitable collapse into the earth that awaits him. That Sunday, the air gnashed with a chill that sank into his marrow, the sky a slab of leaden despair bearing down. She arrived, a tempest in human form, her scarf lashing the wind like a whip, dark hair spilling over her shoulders like ink poured from a shattered vial. She wasn't young, 45 perhaps, her eyes framed by faint lines that whispered of battles fought and won. But those eyes burned, deep and alive, twin flames that could sear through flesh and bone to the quivering soul beneath. Harold fumbled the pump, diesel splashing across his scuffed boots, staining the cracked pavement, and dared a glance upward. Her stare met his, bold as a wolf's, unyielding as the storm that had once uprooted his barn. 3 seconds her lips quivered, a smirk curling like smoke from a smoldering pyre. Then she turned, her silhouette consumed by the sedan's dark maw, tires shrieking as she fled into the gray abyss. His lungs seized, a tremor racking his frame from his bowed shoulders to his unsteady knees, the pump dangling limp as his resolve, its drip a metronome to his racing heart. He hauled himself into the cab, hands quaking against the steering wheel, her image, a brand seared into his mind, sharp cheekbones cutting through the haze, that scarf a scarlet wound slashing the pallor of the day. Her presence, a violation of the sacred tomb he'd built around Mary's memory. Home, he sank into the porch's embrace, the warped boards groaning beneath him, whiskey clutched in a dented tin mug, a poor salve for the fire she'd lit. Mary's specter lingered, her voice lilting rock of ages over a simmering pot of stew, her apron dusted with flour from dough she'd knead with hands so gentle they soothed his every wound, her laughter a balm when the farm's debts piled high. But this woman's eyes devoured that ghost, a forbidden flame licking at the edges of his soul, whispering promises of ruin he couldn't unhear. Monday, he returned to the shell, no fuel needed, only a desperate pilgrimage, his eyes scouring every shadow that crept across the lot, every glint of blue that might herald her return. Nothing greeted him but the wind's hollow moan and the clerk's indifferent stare. Tuesday, he lingered longer, a Coke sweating in his grip, unopened and forgotten, his gaze raking the pumps like a man possessed by a demon he couldn't name, each passing car a torment, each empty moment a lash against his fraying restraint. Wednesday, he prowled the long road, past the quarry's jagged maw where stones lay like broken teeth, past the mill's skeletal remains whispering of lost prosperity, hunting her blue chariot. A fool at 75, with a heart pounding too loud, too alive, thudding against ribs that ached with every beat, jeans tightening with a shameful urgency he couldn't confess. At the feed store, he loitered, hefting sacks he had no use for, his eyes chained to the road, each rumble of an engine a false promise, each glimpse of red a cruel jest. Night fell heavy. He scorched Spam in a skillet, grease hissing like the whispers in his skull. The swings creak a dirge that mocked his unrest. He unearthed Mary's photograph, 68, her laughter frozen in a polka dot dress, him smirking with sideburns and a cocksure tilt, and rasped into the dark. "Forgive me, darlin'," his voice a broken hymn. trembling with the weight of betrayal he couldn't shake. Sleep was a torment. Her scarf coiled around his dreams like a serpent, her stare a whip cracking against his will. Mary's face dissolving into shadow as he thrashed awake, sweat-soaked, chest heaving. A forbidden pulse roaring through limbs too old to bear it. Thursday, the craving gnawed deeper. He fed the hens with hands that shook as though palsied, their grains scattering like ashes. He patched a gate with a mind adrift, splinters biting his palms, her eyes a specter lurking in every warped board, every rusting nail. Friday, he was drawn back to the shell. Her sedan lurked there, a predator at rest, its blue hull glinting under the flickering neon, like a beast crouched to spring. She stood inside, coffee cradled in her hands, scarf loose and dangling, a temptress framed by the station's sickly light. He seized his cane, staggered through the door, lavender scent striking him, a velvet blade slicing through the stale air, cutting deep into senses dulled by years of solitude. She hummed a low, rolling dirge that wound through his skull like a thread of smoke. Her neck bared a freckle, a mark of sin glowing against her pale flesh. He queued behind her, too close, her warmth a siren's call, radiating through the thin fabric of her coat, her tune threading into his marrow, a melody that mocked the hymns Mary once sang. She turned, nodded a flicker of recognition, a spark of something darker, something doomed. Cold out there, she murmured, her voice smooth as a grave's embrace, each syllable a caress that sank into him. Keeps the bones stiff, he croaked, throat a wasteland, heat clawing up his spine, jeans tightening against his will, a forbidden pulse surging through his hips, roaring at 75 with a vigor that shamed him. She smiled, small, deadly, a crescent of peril paid with a rustle of bills, and glided out, hips swaying like a pendulum, tolling his fate. He stood petrified, a statue carved from guilt and want, coffee forgotten on the counter, chest heaving with shallow gasps, blood surging where it hadn't in decades, Mary's ghost recoiling, her soft hands fading as this woman's shadow claimed him, a sin he could neither confess nor deny. Saturday dawned bleak, and Harold etched her essence, an old napkin scarred with red loops, her scarf trembling in his palsied scrawl, the pencil biting into the paper as if to trap her there, to bind her to his crumbling world. He drove to the shell, sat for an hour, truck growling low, exhaust curling upward like a shroud in the frost, waiting, yearning, a man unmoored by a vision he couldn't exercise. She didn't appear, and the absence gnawed, a void where her presence should have burned. He fed the hens, their clucks a taunt echoing Mary's laughter, hauled grain with a body protesting every lift, his mind a prisoner to her eyes, her hum, the way her scarf slipped an inch to bare forbidden flesh, a glimpse that branded his soul. Sunday, he wound Mary's music box, its hymn, blessed assurance, a frail whisper, cracking under the weight of her shadow, the notes splintering like glass against the memory of her voice. Guilt gnashed at him, Mary's hands kneading bread with a tenderness that once healed him, her voice summoning him from the fields with a warmth he'd never find again. But this woman's fire consumed it all, a heat pooling in his loins, jeans tugging with every step, a sin he couldn't bury beneath the dirt where Mary lay. Monday, she returned, pumping gas, scarf whipping like a lash in the wind's cruel grasp. Harold parked, watched from the cab. She bent to check a tire, scarf falling loose, hair grazing her cheek, a vision of ruin that stopped his breath. She glanced his way, an eternity trapped in a single blink, then drove off, leaving him cursing into the wind, palms slick against the wheel. A 75-year-old husk set ablaze, jeans tight, legs quaking with a need too profane to name, a shiver racing from his spine to his core. Tuesday, he dared to breach the void she was filling up, and he staggered over, canes sinking into gravel, breath a ragged fog clouding the cold air before him. Nice car, he growled, voice a shattered husk scraping against his throat, heart slamming against ribs like a beast clawing free. She looked up, smiled slow, venomous, a serpent's promise. Thanks, old but runs sweet. Like me, he rasped, a fool's jest born of desperation, ears burning red as blood rushed to his face, roaring south through veins too frail to bear it. She laughed deep, resonant, a sound that coiled around his soul. Maybe so. See you around, she purred, peeling out, her laugh a chain dragging him deeper into shadow. He stood, swaying against the wind, her sound echoing in the hollows of his skull, legs buckling beneath him, a pulse thudding low, jeans straining with a vigor that mocked his years, damnation pulsing in every beat. Mary's memory, a faint cry drowned by this tempest's roar. Wednesday, he prowled the lot, sat with a Coke gone warm, its metal slick with condensation, eyes raking the horizon like a hawk starved for prey. She rolled in at dusk, scarf shed for a gray coat, but her eyes sliced through the gloom feral, alive, a predator's gleam. He lurched out, cane slipping in the mud, voice hoarse. You a regular, she smirked. When fate drags me back. Harold, he choked, the word torn from him, ticker hammering against his ribs like a fist on a coffin lid. Nice to meet you, Harold, she breathed, his name a curse woven into her tone, and vanished, sedan roaring into the twilight, leaving him gasping, face aflame with a flush he couldn't hide, a stir kicking through his old bones, igniting embers he'd sworn were ash. Thursday, he unraveled beneath her spell-raked leaves until his arms bled sweat, the rake's teeth tearing at the earth as if to unearth Mary's forgiveness. Hauled feed until his back wept in protest, sacks thudding like accusations. Her nice to meet you, a chant pounding in his skull, chest locked tight, heat surging through him, jeans tugging with every thought of her lips parting, her scarf brushing her throat. Friday night, he sat on the porch, whiskey afire, searing his gut, the mug dented from years of clenched fists, staring at her napkin sketch. Her face a haunting, etched in red and shadow, lips open as if whispering his doom, eyes a noose tightening around his will. Sleep was a descent into perdition, her leaning near, scarf brushing his cheek with a touch softer than Mary's ever was. A whisper he chased through the dark, waking him drenched, breath ragged. An ache low and relentless he couldn't kill, jeans tight, his body a traitor to the vows he'd etched in stone. Saturday broke cold and merciless. He was at the Shell by 8, her sedan a shadow lurking in the lot, her sipping coffee inside with a grace that belied her danger. He shuffled in, cane cracking against the tile, stood close, too close, her warmth a flame licking at his edges. Back again, she teased, smirk lethal as a viper's strike, eyes glinting with a sin he couldn't unsee. Can't stay away, he rasped, voice raw and broken, hands trembling against the cane, jeans tight as a vise, heat roaring untamed through his frame. She laughed, good to know, a velvet blade, and brushed past, her coat grazing his arm, a bolt tearing through him like lightning splitting a dead oak, leaving him panting, nerves alight as if electrified. Marries him a wisp of smoke against the torrent of her tide. Sunday, he hunted with a fervor that bordered madness, truck idling in the lot, engine growling low, eyes peeled like a hawk's, scouring the gray for her. She pulled in, scarf red as hellfire blazing against her coat, stepped out and stretched, the fabric lifting an inch, tan skin flashing like a forbidden promise. He was out in a heartbeat, cane be damned, hobbling toward her. Harold again, she taunted, voice low and rich with menace. Caught me, he grunted, ticker racing like a stallion loosed, face burning with a flush that painted him guilty, legs shaky. A thudding low he couldn't bury beneath the weight of his years. Persistent, she murmured, leaning close. Don't stop, her breath a scalding mist against his ear, her scent lavender and sin flooding his lungs. Then she was gone, sedan roaring off into the dusk. He stood, chest heaving, hands clawing the cane, until his knuckles whitened. A 75-year-old ember raging wild, jeans tight as a drum, sweat pouring down his back. Her words of venom seeping into his veins, Mary's ghost a faint sob lost in the wind as he staggered back. Her don't stop a command he couldn't defy, a sin he couldn't unmake. Monday night, he sat alone, porch shrouded in dark. Whiskey drained her voice a lash across his mind, breath short and ragged, a pulse hammering through him, jeans straining against a need that shamed him, the napkin sketch clutched in his fist, her eyes a sentence of damnation he couldn't escape. A prisoner to a fire he'd never quench. She's branded me, Harold, 75, enslaved to her sin. And Mary's shade weeps in despair. Tomorrow, I'll hunt again, perhaps steal her name, her flame. Is this damnation or deliverance? Tell me, gents, ever had a stare chain you tight and wondered how far you'd bleed for its sting? Drop it below, hit subscribe, and next time, I'll confess if I seize her or shatter into dust.